hospital floor was cold, coarse, almost damp. Margaret was sitting on it, hunched over, whispering something unintelligible as she clutched a piece of fabric to her chest. Her eyes were distant, bloodshot, as if she hadn't blinked in hours. A paramedic found her like that near the observation room and urgently called for a nurse. When they tried to lift her, she spoke for the first time in a clear voice. The heart. The heart is missing. No one understood at first. They assumed it was confusion, maybe shock, or perhaps an episode brought on by her age. But when Father Thomas arrived a few minutes later, he looked nearly as pale as she did. He didn't explain anything. He only said he would stay with her, that she shouldn't be alone. At the reception desk, an attendant was entering her information into the system when something unusual caught her eye. From Margaret's loosely closed purse, an old, wrinkled cloth with dark stains was peeking out. The employee hesitated but said nothing. It looked like aged fabric, maybe something sentimental. But what nobody noticed was the subtle weight that had settled over the corridor ever since Margaret stepped in. As if the air had thickened, as if the hospital, used to death, recognized that something different had entered its walls. 2 weeks earlier, Margaret had been lucid, strong, despite her years. She was a widow, had buried her husband, her parents, even one of her sons, without ever letting her strength falter. For her, death was just part of life's cycle. But Zella's funeral wasn't like the others. That afternoon, the town of Eden felt like it was burning. The sun hung low, pressing down on everything. Still, Margaret shivered. A chill crawled down her spine the moment she passed through the cemetery gate. Around her, everything seemed normal. Ancient trees, silent birds, the sound of footsteps crunching over dry dirt. But there was something in the air, something invisible, yet present. She told herself it was grief, or maybe just old age. Until, during the ceremony, she noticed a figure standing among the trees. It didn't move. It made no sound. It had no face. It seemed wrapped in its own shadow, unmoving, as if it didn't belong to that world. She tried to dismiss it, told herself it was just a cemetery worker, someone out of place, someone standing a bit too far. But her gut rejected the excuse, and then she felt it. Whoever that figure was, it was watching her, without question. It lasted just a moment, a glance between eyes that weren't even there, but it was enough to brand her. If you're drawn to stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell, and let us know in the comments. What's the worst experience you've ever lived through? The ceremony went on. The priest prayed, but Margaret's mind was already far away. What she didn't yet know was that the presence wouldn't vanish once the burial ended. After the funeral, Margaret returned home carrying a strange heaviness in her chest. It wasn't sadness. It was denser, heavier. As she walked through the neighborhood, she didn't respond to the neighbors' greetings. Her thoughts were still trapped on that faceless figure standing between the trees. She tried to believe it was heat, exhaustion, or grief. But deep down, she didn't buy it. That night she couldn't sleep. She went to bed early, locked every window, turned off every light. But her body remained restless. Her eyes flicked open at the smallest creak. Around 3 in the morning, she heard footsteps on the sidewalk. Nothing unusual. Her house was near a busy avenue. But these steps were different. Slow, steady, like someone walking without direction, but also without stopping. She got up and approached the window, pulled back just a sliver of the curtain and looked outside. Nothing, just the empty street and a flickering lamppost. But just as she turned to go back to bed, something shifted at the edge of her vision. Quick, like a shadow slipping away before it could be seen. She shut the curtain tightly. Her breathing quickened. The chill returned. Over the next few days, Margaret tried to return to normal. She cooked, cleaned, watered her plants. But with every step, she felt eyes on her. Sometimes, as she passed the hallway mirror, she thought she saw a figure standing at the far end. When she turned, nothing. Other times she heard her name, a faint whisper, Margaret, like the wind knew how to speak. A week later, while sweeping her front walk, she saw Manuel approaching, the cemetery's groundskeeper. His clothes were dirty, face pale. He walked quickly, eyes sunken. Without small talk, he said, "I need to talk to you." She let him in, poured coffee without saying a word. Sitting across from each other at the table, he began, "Since Zella's burial, strange things are happening. It's not just you." Margaret stared silently. Her body stiffened. "Every morning when I get to the cemetery, the dirt over her grave is disturbed. At first I thought it was dogs or some animal, but no, it's not that. It's like someone or something is trying to get out." Margaret's stomach clenched. "Have you told anyone?" "Who, Margaret? Who would believe this?" He paused, lowering his voice. "Last night, I went to lock the gate and I heard footsteps, right near her grave. But there was no one there, I swear, and I felt something, like someone watching me, from beneath the soil." Margaret's hands trembled. She wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. She only knew one thing: she wasn't alone in what she felt. And what Manuel hadn't yet revealed was only the beginning of what he was about to confess. Margaret didn't sleep that night either. Manuel's words echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. Something was stirring beneath the ground. Something that by all natural law should have been silent, but wasn't. At sunrise, after another sleepless night, she decided she could no longer ignore it. She called her neighbor, Annette, and asked her to come with her to the cemetery. At first, Annette hesitated. She didn't understand the urgency. But Margaret's voice was different, shaky, heavy with tension she'd never heard before. "I need to see it for myself," Margaret said, offering no further explanation. The walk to the cemetery was quiet. The sky was covered in clouds, and the air smelled of ancient moisture like it did before rain. When they arrived, they both noticed it instantly. Something was off. The place was quieter than usual. No birds, no insects, only their footsteps crunching against the gravel broke the silence. As they neared Zella's grave, both women stopped in their tracks. The earth was indeed disturbed, but not superficially. It looked like something from underneath had pushed the soil outward. There were no shovel marks, no signs that someone had dug from above. It was different, more desperate. "Do you think someone tried to steal something?" Annette asked in a hushed tone, as if afraid to be overheard. "I don't know," Margaret answered, stepping closer, "but this doesn't look like it was done by a person." Both women crouched down for a closer look, and that's when they heard it. A faint sound, like a scratching, slow, rhythmic. It came from inside the grave. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, as if something were clawing from the inside of the coffin. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Annette stood upright instantly, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that? We're leaving," Margaret said, not raising her voice, but with a firmness that left no room for argument. They walked away quickly, not looking back. The cemetery returned to its stillness, but in their minds, the sound kept echoing. Back at home, Margaret locked every window carefully. She pulled down the blinds. She turned the key in the front door, making sure it was secure. Then she sat on the living room couch and stared into the void for what felt like an eternity. She knew something was wrong, but what disturbed her most wasn't the sound, the disturbed soil, or even the eerie stillness of the cemetery. It was the certainty that had been growing deep within her. Zella wasn't at rest. And that very night something would happen that would confirm her worst fears. At exactly 2 a.m., Margaret was awakened by a sharp thud, like a knock on the window. She sat up in bed, confused, unsure whether it had been real or just a dream. The rest of the house was completely silent. She held her breath, her heart pounding. Then it came again. A second knock, louder, coming from the dining room window, the one facing the backyard. Margaret got up slowly, barefoot, walking down the dark hallway. Each step stretched longer than the last. When she reached the dining room, she approached the curtain cautiously. With a trembling hand, she moved it just enough to see outside. The street was empty, but something caught her eye. Directly across the road, by an old tree twisted with age, a figure was standing. It didn't move. It made no gestures, but it was unmistakably human. Or at least it appeared to be. It was completely cloaked in shadow, as though the streetlight couldn't touch it. A chill shot down Margaret's spine. She backed away instantly, closed the curtain, and leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breath. She was certain of what she had seen. It wasn't a trick of the mind. She tried to return to bed, but sleep was no longer possible. The next morning, she made a decision. She could no longer bear this fear alone. She needed to understand what was happening. And there was only one person left who might hold the answers she sought: Father Thomas. She found him at the church, in his small office cluttered with worn books. The priest greeted her with a solemn expression. He didn't ask anything, as if he already sensed she hadn't come to confess. "Father," she said, sitting across from his desk, "I need to speak with you. It's about Zella." Father Thomas's face tightened. He was silent for a moment before replying. "No one said that name around here for years." Margaret told him everything. The figure at the burial, the whispers, the gravedigger, the disturbed earth, the noise from within the grave. When she finished, the priest stared fixedly at the crucifix on the wall. Then he stood, walked to a bookshelf, and pulled down a dusty volume. "There are things better left undisturbed, my child," he said gravely. "But if what you say is true, then maybe Zella wasn't buried whole." Margaret furrowed her brow, puzzled. "What do you mean, not whole?" The priest shut the book firmly. "There are old whispers, stories, about certain people, those who practice strange things, having their hearts removed before burial. And in Zella's case, perhaps those whispers were true. He laid the book on the table but didn't open it. There was no need. What he was about to say wasn't in any text. It was something he'd heard many years ago, something he had tried to forget. "When Zella died," he began in a low voice, "there were people who didn't want her buried like everyone else. They said she practiced things, kept strange books, spoke to herself at night, had unusual visitors." Margaret listened without interruption. Every word confirmed what she had felt since the funeral. "I didn't understand it at the time," he continued, "but the elders asked me not to bless her body in the usual way. The ceremony was shorter, more symbolic. They never told me why, but years later one of the old gravediggers whispered to me that Zella had been buried without her heart. The silence that followed was heavy, like stone. "So, where is it?" Margaret asked. The priest didn't answer immediately. He walked across the room, stopping at a window that looked out onto the church's back garden. "If they really did remove it, they must have hidden it somewhere no one would think to look. And what if that's what's causing all of this?" Margaret pressed. "What if Zella needs it back?" He turned to her, his face serious. "It's possible. The dead, they don't always rest if something's left unfinished." Margaret stood, determined. "Then we need to find it." The priest hesitated. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 8 in the evening. The church was empty. Outside, the wind howled, branches scraping the stained glass. "There's a place," he finally murmured, "the crypt beneath the church. No one's entered it in decades. Maybe, but I can't make any promises." He took an old flashlight from his desk, a rusty key from a hidden drawer, and led her to a door at the end of the hallway. They descended slowly down a stone staircase. The air grew heavier, damp. Time felt frozen in that space. At the bottom, a granite slab covered a rectangular opening. The priest pushed with effort. Beneath it, a dark chamber, cloaked in dust and filled with forgotten items under aged cloths. And there, in an unmarked wooden box, was the unthinkable, a human heart, dry, hardened with time, but still whole. Wrapped in a yellowed rag, threads once crimson now faded. Margaret said nothing. The silence between them was complete. Only the wind above, rattling the church, broke the tension. "Is this what you were looking for?" the priest asked, not meeting her eyes. She nodded, feeling the familiar cold surround her once again. And somehow she knew Zella was already aware they had found it. They left the crypt in silence, the heart wrapped carefully in Margaret's hands. Father Thomas held the flashlight, though its battery was dying. Shadows stretched along the church hallways, and the air was even heavier than before. Margaret didn't speak. Her steps were firm, as if every part of her already knew what had to be done. But inside, fear clawed at her, desperate to break free. At the church's main door, the priest stopped her. "Margaret, listen closely. What you're about to do, there's no going back. If this truly is what's binding her, returning it might release her. But if it's something else, we could be unleashing something worse." She met his gaze, her eyes red, but unwavering. "There's no choice. They woke her the day they buried her incomplete. I just want it to end." The walk to the cemetery was short, but it felt eternal. The wind howled, lifting dust and dry leaves. Street lamps flickered. When they reached the gates, they found the padlock broken. The iron gate hung open. Neither of them said a word. They moved through narrow paths. The earth crunched beneath their feet. Zella's grave lay at the far end, between cypress trees that seemed to lean in toward them. The tombstone looked just as they had left it days before, but the soil was disturbed once more. Margaret knelt beside the hollow. The priest began praying softly, gripping his rosary tightly. They opened the coffin. Zella's body was still there, shockingly intact, as though time had passed her by. Her chest was open, an empty space, waiting. With trembling hands, Margaret placed the heart inside. She did it gently, almost reverently. As she did, the air shifted. A sudden warmth filled the space, soft but palpable, as if some invisible pressure had finally lifted. The priest fell silent. The whispers that had haunted so many nights were gone. "It's done," he said, barely audible. Margaret stayed a moment longer, staring at Zella's face. Something was different. She couldn't say if it was peace or absence. But that oppressive presence, the one that had followed her since the funeral, was no longer there. They closed the coffin, covered it again. No words were exchanged. There was no need. As they exited the cemetery, the wind had ceased. The sky, once overcast, now revealed a faint line of light on the horizon. The priest looked at her. "Do you feel it?" he asked. Margaret nodded. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel watched. But as they passed through the cemetery gate, both of them paused. From somewhere within, behind the trees, something cracked. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something that shouldn't have moved. And even if Zella's soul had finally found peace, something else remained. Days went by, and at first, everything seemed to have settled. Margaret walked through her home without closing every curtain. The silence was no longer so heavy. She could sleep for a few hours without waking in panic, and Father Thomas resumed his duties at the church with a semblance of normalcy. But the peace didn't last. One afternoon, while Margaret was preparing coffee, she received an unexpected visit from two city officers. They were looking for the gravedigger, Manuel, who was still missing. No signs, no reports, no clues. He had simply left his house open, as if he had stepped out for a moment and never returned. Margaret didn't know what to say. The last thing she remembered from Manuel was his trembling voice, his eyes carrying something more than exhaustion. It was pure fear. After the officers left, something began to nag at her, not because of their questions, but because of something Manuel had said, something she hadn't fully understood at the time. That the spirit didn't seem to come solely from Zella's grave, but from something deeper within the cemetery. That night, Margaret went back over the papers Father Thomas had shown her days earlier. Among them was a list of old burials, names, dates, annotations. One detail stood out. On the same day Zella was buried, another burial had taken place, one that was never mentioned during the ceremony, never recorded publicly. The body of an unidentified man. Why would they bury two people on the same day and only talk about one? She asked aloud. The next morning, she went to see Father Thomas. She found him in the back of the sacristy, going through some files. When she showed him the document, he frowned. "I don't remember that name," he admitted. "But there were rumors. People said another coffin was placed in an unmarked grave, a body nobody claimed. Where is that grave?" The priest hesitated. He took a deep breath before answering. "Same row as Zella, 3 graves down, but it's sealed. No one has ever opened it. A knot formed in Margaret's stomach. That night she couldn't resist. She grabbed a flashlight and returned to the cemetery alone. She needed to see that grave, to confirm something she didn't fully understand, but that pulsed inside her like an unshakable certainty. She walked between the tombstones until she found it. An unmarked grave, covered in weeds. But the most disturbing thing was that as she approached, she felt the same chill she had felt on the day of the funeral, the same heavy air, the same pressure on her chest. And then she heard it, a whisper. It didn't say her name, it didn't form words, just a mournful sound, like weeping beneath the soil, as if someone long forgotten was pleading to be heard. Margaret backed away slowly. It wasn't over. Zella's rest had only been part of the story. There was another presence there, one no one knew about, one no one wanted to uncover. She returned home with shaking legs. She had spent more than half an hour in the cemetery, motionless before that nameless grave, listening to the muted weeping rising from below. She didn't dare tell Father Thomas, not yet, not until she understood what was truly happening. The next morning, she did something she hadn't done in years. She went to the town archive. She asked for access to the cemetery's old records. Patiently, she combed through folder after folder until she found the book for the month Zella was buried. There it was, a sparse entry, no name. Just a date, a time, and a note. Unidentified male body, transferred directly from the morgue under superior order. Discreet burial, no ceremony. Margaret wrote down the grave location. It matched, 3 spots down from Zella. But something else stood out. A handwritten note in the margin, barely legible. "Do not open under any circumstance." That line haunted her all day. That night, the nightmares returned. She dreamed of shifting earth, of muffled cries that wouldn't stop. In the dream, she knelt at the nameless grave and dug with her hands until mud covered her arms. When she finally opened the casket, there was no body, only a black void that pulled her in with violent force. She woke soaked in sweat, her nails embedded in her palms. The next day, she went straight to Father Thomas. "Father, I need you to come with me to the cemetery again, but it's not about Zella. It's another grave." He looked at her silently. He didn't ask why. He just grabbed his keys and walked with her to the exit. They reached the cemetery as the sun was beginning to set. The place felt different, darker, as if the trees, the headstones, even the ground itself knew this wasn't an ordinary visit. They stopped in front of the nameless grave. Margaret pointed at the headstone. A man was buried here, the same day as Zella. The priest read the numbers etched in stone. He frowned. "I never paid attention to this grave." Margaret stepped closer. "I heard something, like crying. It wasn't my imagination." Father Thomas looked at her, but not with disbelief. This time, it was fear. "Margaret, if this is real, and someone was buried here without anyone remembering, maybe Zella wasn't the only one silenced that day." They stared at each other in silence. The wind picked up, scattering dry leaves around them, and in that moment, something overwhelming wrapped around them. It wasn't the cold, it wasn't the fear, it was the certainty that they were being watched from below. Father Thomas refused to return to the cemetery in the days that followed. He said he needed time to reflect, but Margaret knew something in him had cracked. His gaze, once steady, now avoided hers, as if that nameless grave had awakened a buried guilt. But Margaret couldn't wait. At dawn on Thursday, she returned alone, carrying a borrowed shovel and a flashlight in her backpack. She wasn't seeking answers out of curiosity. She needed them. The cemetery was no longer just a resting place. It had become a dark knot, tightening around her daily life. She heard footsteps behind her at home. Lights flickered without cause. Shadows darted across the hall when she thought she was alone. And in her dreams, a voice, not Zella's. It was deeper, more demanding. When she stood again before the nameless grave, the air shifted once more. That same dry cold. That same suffocating silence she had felt with Father Thomas. But she didn't hesitate. She began to dig, ignoring her fatigue, the wet soil, her numb hands. Every strike of the shovel felt like a jolt, connecting her to something beneath. After nearly an hour, the blade hit wood. An old coffin, rusted hinges, the lid stained with age. Margaret knelt beside it, breath heavy, and positioned the flashlight to illuminate the top. There was no name, no date, only a mark, crudely carved by hand, an upside-down cross. Her heart pounded. She hesitated, but then the voice came again, not a thought, a whisper. "Open!" With trembling hands, she forced the lid up. Inside, the coffin was empty. Empty, except for an old cloth carefully folded covering something. Margaret pulled it back slowly. And there it was. A second heart, not dried, not hardened. It was dark, nearly black, but fresh, as if it had been removed recently. As if it was still faintly beating. Margaret fell backward, horrified. How could it be there? Whose was it? Why had it been hidden? She couldn't process it. The flashlight began to flicker. A sound rose around her, barely audible, like someone breathing near her ear. A chill ran down her spine. She turned quickly. Nothing. But she felt it. Something was near. Too near. She closed the coffin, covered the grave as best she could, and ran out of the cemetery without looking back. She knew it wasn't over. Zella had been laid to rest, but that second heart was still waiting to be claimed. Margaret spent the entire night sitting in her living room, lights on, the dirty shovel propped against the wall. She couldn't sleep. The heart, that second heart, wouldn't leave her thoughts. She didn't understand what she had found, but something in her whispered it wasn't just a forgotten organ. The next morning she went straight to Father Thomas. She found him in the sacristy, preparing for Mass. He saw her pale face and invited her to sit without question. But as soon as she began to speak, his hands began to shake. "Another heart," he murmured, disbelieving. Yes, in the nameless grave, buried with a body. That was no longer there. The priest went silent. For several seconds, he wrestled with his thoughts. Then he stood and walked to a shelf hidden behind a curtain. He pulled out an old leather-bound notebook covered in dust. He placed it on the table. "This book doesn't belong to the church," he said, without looking at her. "It was given to me years ago when I was just a seminarian. I was warned never to read it unless absolutely necessary." He opened it carefully, flipping through pages filled with drawings, symbols, handwritten notes, until he stopped at a name, Zella, and just beneath it, another word written in different ink, bond. "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. The priest swallowed hard before answering. "There are old theories, very old, that some people don't pass on alone, that to keep their power in this world, they make a pact. They give something in return, but must be buried with a bond, something that ensures that while one part of them rests, the other stays awake." Margaret felt the cold crawl up her spine. "Are you saying that second heart was her bond, her guardian, her anchor to this world?" Silence fell between them. Then the priest leaned toward her. "Where did you leave it?" "I covered it, buried it again, but I didn't seal the grave." He stood immediately. "We need to close that place, seal it. No one else must go near it." That same afternoon, they returned to the cemetery one final time. They filled the grave to the brim, placed heavy stones on top. Father Thomas prayed softly while Margaret stood silently, hands clasped, watching as every shovelful of earth buried what should never have been unearthed. When they were done, no words were exchanged. There was no need. Margaret returned home, drew the curtains, and sat by the window. Outside, the sky began to cloud over again. A faint breeze rustled the leaves of the tree across the street. And just as she was about to rise, something made her stop. A murmur, faint, low. It didn't say her name. It didn't come from her mind. It came from beneath the ground, and it spoke a single word: return.